I'm going to provide sort of an overview of smart subsidy systems in fertilizer and try to address this question: is this new wine or is this just new bottles? Is this a new label or is this really kind of an innovation in supporting fertilizer use in sub-Saharan Africa? I'm going to start out by just providing an overview of some of the reasons that are given for subsidizing inputs in Africa, and then talk about the experience of fertilizer subsidies in the 70s and 80s, the old kind of traditional systems, and then the renewed interest since about 2005 in fertilizer subsidies in the continent, and in particular talk about the experience with input vouchers. Okay, why subsidize fertilizer in Africa? The standard argument is that this kind of comes down to three parts. First, sub-Saharan Africa has some of the highest rates of poverty and malnutrition in the world. These two maps, one from IFPRI, one from FAO, kind of demonstrate this. It's the Global Hunger Index on the left side and FAO estimates of the incidence of undernourishment on the right side. And in both of them, you see that in Africa, there are more serious problems than in most other parts of the world. Okay, the second item is that one of the reasons for this malnutrition is that we have stagnant per capita food production in the region. This graph shows each region. You can see strong growth in East Asia, which would include China, of course, and all four of the regions, West Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa, all are either about stagnant or slightly negative rates of growth in food production, in per capita food production. And part of the reason for this is that input use is very low in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a graph of fertilizer application rates in kilograms of nutrients per hectare of arable land. And you can see that fertilizer use is much lower in sub-Saharan Africa than other regions. And so the logic is, you have poverty, it's due to very low productivity in food production, and this is linked to fertilizer, so if you can just get farmers to use more fertilizer, this will correct the previous two problems. But the problem with this logic is that it really doesn't, there isn't a strong connection necessarily between the two. We don't know that fertilizer is the best way to increase food production. We don't know that increasing food production is absolutely necessary for improving conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. It seems fairly logical, but there are countries and regions which have prospered without dramatic growth in food production. Okay, so from an economic point of view, we really need to look at what is it about the fertilizer market that makes a subsidy justifiable, or what might be a good rationale in economic terms. One would be efficiency. Fertilizer use by farmers according to most studies, is suboptimal. It's below the profit maximizing point. And getting to Joachim's question, the reasons for this are lack of information. Farmers may not know what the returns to fertilizer are. Lack of liquidity. Even if they know the returns to fertilizer, they may not have the cash on hand or have access to credit to buy fertilizer. And even if they have the information and the credit, they may be risk averse. They may be concerned that in a low rainfall year, they won't get much harvest, the fertilizer won't do much good, and they have this additional cost now of the fertilizer, so that for a risk-averse farmer, using little or no fertilizer might not be a bad option, or it's understandable, put it that way. So a subsidy might raise fertilizer to the optimal level if farmers are underutilizing it. Now, it's a little complicated to say that they are underutilizing fertilizer because of the risk issue. It's hard to measure the risk and to take into account or to know to what degree they should be reducing fertilizer because of the high risk. The second argument would be equity. Farmers are poorer than non-farmers in most countries, and so a subsidy on fertilizer is assistance to poor people. And obviously that has a strong political angle as well, strong political motivation. And governments want to show that they are trying to do something for farmers. On the other hand, untargeted subsidies tend to help farmers in proportion to the amount of fertilizer that they use. So it's going to help larger farmers more than smaller farmers. And then a third argument would be externalities. It's not a widely used justification, but you could, the argument about soil mining and depleting the soils and could be converted to an externality argument. You could say there's an intergenerational externality, that if farmers don't use fertilizer now, they're leaving their descendants poorer soils, and so that a subsidy might be justified on those grounds. Okay, moving on to the experience with fertilizer subsidies. In the 70s, I'll go through this quickly, partly because I don't have time, but partly because I imagine many of you are familiar with this. But in the 70s and 80s, most governments in sub-Saharan Africa had some kind of a legal monopoly on the importation and distribution of fertilizer. It was sold to farmers at very subsidized rates. It was rationed, and usually the price was only 20 to 60% of the full cost. And the overvaluation of exchange rates added to the implicit subsidy for imported fertilizer. Now there was some variation, but this is sort of the general pattern that you saw in most countries. Problems, these are documented in numerous studies, but late delivery, the necessity of rationing, as Balu mentioned, displacement of the private sector. The channel was entirely a government managed system, and high fiscal cost, more than 3% of the government budget in a number of different countries. This was perhaps affordable during the commodity boom of the 70s, but in the 80s, many African countries were facing serious fiscal balance issues, and this led to the structural adjustment programs, which involved market liberalization and price decontrol in general, but in the case of fertilizer, it meant phasing out of subsidies, the introduction of competition, sometimes the dismantling of the parastatal that was in charge of distributing fertilizer. The timing varied between countries, and there are some countries that went through it more completely than others, but this was sort of the general trend in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. Now, the conventional wisdom is that these reforms contributed to macroeconomic stability, lower inflation, higher growth rates, but that they did reduce fertilizer use. This is sort of a necessary evil, if you will, of eliminating the subsidies. But if you look at application rates for the continent, you really don't see that much of a hit. This period in this colored area in the middle goes from 1987 to 1993, which is the period when a lot of countries were liberalizing fertilizer markets. And you don't see a very noticeable drop in fertilizer application rates during that period. Of course, this is continent-wide. You may have issues within specific countries. We looked at 9 countries where there was a clear period of phasing out subsidies. And fertilizer use declined in 5 of them, but it increased in 3 of them. Sorry, did I say 9? It's 8 countries. I can go into some of the reasons for this in the discussion, but the basic message is that subsidies are only one factor in determining the price of fertilizer, and price is only one factor in determining how much fertilizer is used. There's also lateness and the appropriate, or the timing and the appropriate types of fertilizer and a number of other issues. Okay, so since 2005, there's been this renewal of interest in fertilizer subsidies, and the number of factors behind this. Jeffrey Sachs has been an active proponent of this. The experience in Malawi, where they introduced subsidies and were able to achieve self-sufficiency and even exported to Zimbabwe, of all places, exported maize. The Abuja Fertilizer Summit in 2006 said that fertilizer was a strategic commodity and encouraged countries to consider targeted subsidies. And then the food crisis provided both, 2 rationales. One, higher food prices, it's important to increase supply, but also with higher fertilizer prices, there was sort of a motive to help farmers cope with higher prices. Now, just to clarify, to make a distinction here, smart subsidies generally refer to subsidies that are targeted to the poor and designed to promote rather than replace the private sector. And it's not really a policy, it's more like a goal or an objective. An input voucher is a specific technique for delivering fertilizer in which farmers receive a certificate and they can use that certificate to buy at a reduced price or possibly free fertilizer and other inputs. But they're really not equivalent. You can use vouchers to implement a smart subsidy scheme, but not all voucher schemes are going to be smart according to the definition that I've given here. And we'll see some examples of that in a minute. So vouchers are compatible with targeting and private sector distribution of inputs, but not really a necessary component. Okay, and so vouchers were seen as a way to stimulate fertilizer use, but avoid some of the problems that were widespread in the 70s and 80s. Malawi is the sort of prime example that's often given. They have a whole sort of a long history, an evolution of different types of fertilizer subsidies, the universal subsidies until the mid-90s, starter pack system. Then they tried targeting it a bit more in the early years of this decade. And then in 2005, they implemented this, or launched this agricultural input subsidy program, which involved fairly large quantities, 100 kilos of fertilizer, at a fairly high subsidy, and it uses vouchers, but this is a really key point. Vouchers cannot be redeemed at private agro input dealers. They can only be redeemed at one of two parastatals. So basically the private sector is completely locked out of the fertilizer market, and the share of fertilizer sold by farmers, sold by the private sector, has actually declined since this program was implemented because the subsidized fertilizer now accounts for about half of the total, up from 10 to 40% earlier. So the strengths of the system are that it's on a large scale. It has achieved very visible results in terms of achieving self-sufficiency, although there's a question as to how much good weather played a role there. And it has a very detailed system for monitoring and evaluation. The weakness is that private retailers are almost entirely excluded from the system, so that according to the definition that we've given, you really can't consider this a smart subsidy. It does not work through the private sector. It has relatively high costs, particularly now with the higher fertilizer cost. There have been issues with late delivery because the whole system is tied up to the budget cycle and decision makings in the government there. Okay, Tanzania used to have a transportation subsidy. There were a number of problems related to that. In 2007, they launched this National Agricultural Input Voucher Scheme, which is similar to the system in Malawi. It allows farmers to buy 2 bags of fertilizer and 1 bag of seed. It's targeted both in terms of districts and in terms of farmers within the district. But one big difference is that the vouchers can be redeemed at private input dealers. And the input dealers, in turn, redeem them at branches of a microfinance bank, which has branches all over the country, so it makes it much easier for them to redeem these vouchers. The program is being complemented by training and certification of agro-input dealers, and this has World Bank support for 3 years, covering about half of the cost. The cost is started out around 60 million, and it's projected to rise to about 150 million, I believe, maybe next year. Ghana and Kenya have also implemented voucher schemes on a smaller scale, and in Ghana there was a problem of late delivery. but this is the first year, so maybe they can iron out some of those problems. Okay, so let me just give 2 slides to draw some general conclusions. The conventional wisdom of the subsidies in the 70s and 80s is that they were costly. 2 minutes? 1 minute? Okay, short. But the evidence that I presented here, fairly simple analysis, indicates that there isn't really strong evidence of a uniform reduction in fertilizer use with the elimination of the subsidies. Can vouchers promote private distribution networks? Yes, if it's well designed. Malawi is a case where it doesn't work that way. Ghana, to some degree, some dealers were able to use it and some weren't. In Tanzania, there's a much better chance of well, it is involving the private sector. Can vouchers be targeted to the poor? It's not easy, particularly in the sub-Saharan African context. In Malawi, studies have shown that there isn't that much difference between recipients and non-recipients. Are they vulnerable to delays in delivery? Yes, we do see cases of that. It may perform better than the old systems, but there are still problems with it. Are vouchers a good investment, or are these subsidies a good investment? Here, I think we need more evidence. There's one study that estimated the benefit-cost ratio in Malawi was between 0.76 and 1.36. So they may or may not be getting back enough additional production to justify the cost of the program. So the lessons are vouchers should be widely redeemable. The funding has to be provided early to avoid late delivery. We need transparency and communication of the goals. That the voucher programs need to be complemented by both fertilizer market development activities and agriculture research, roads, and other investments. I think that Tanzania is a much better model to follow than Malawi, but there are still some questions even with the Tanzanian case. Will the benefits justify cost? Is the targeting feasible? And is it fiscally sustainable? Will Tanzania be able to maintain this program, particularly as the bank withdraws after 3 years? I guess I should mention Tanzania plans to phase it out, but politically that may be difficult.